Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and it's such an honor to be with you all, learning from you all, and I hope my comments today will be helpful to you. There are no two ways about it. We are in a dire situation environmentally. Just look at the impacts of global warming that we've been witnessing this year, the havoc that was wreaked by those superstorms, Maria, Harvey, Irma, all of them. We ran out of words to describe how severe they were. The National Weather Service had to add a new color to their chart for rainfall because they'd never seen more than 50 inches of rainfall in a matter of days. And while a third of Houston lay underwater across the world in Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, more than a third of Bangladesh lay underwater from climate-induced flooding. It's disastrous. And we have already various villages and islands that have been subsumed by rising sea levels. That's the wet side. Then there's the dry side. We have the droughts and the famines. We have these wildfires, which, by the way, we went through this exact same thing in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest this year. And it's worse than that. We have acidity rising in the ocean. We have actually small sea creatures starting to dissolve. We have roads melting in India last year as the temperature topped 122 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a dire situation. And if we keep on pulling fossil fuels out of the ground and burning them, it's just going to get worse. And we are really at a risk of turning out the lights for all humanity on this stuff, making the world uninhabitable. So President Donald Trump has announced that we are not going to honor the Paris Accord on climate. He's appointed an Exxon CEO, former Exxon CEO, to be the Secretary of State. The head of EPA is a person who was committed to dismantling EPA. The words climate change have been erased from various websites, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to be very, very clear about something important. The direction that Donald Trump is taking us in is not a new direction. It is the same direction we were heading in under Democrats, including Barack Obama. Now, some people are surprised by that, bristle at that, and say, no, he was a climate hero. I hear that we have to preserve his legacy. There were token gestures made for renewables and other good things. But really, the Obama administration was a climate-destroying administration. President Obama was very proud of the tens of thousands of miles of pipelines that were added because of his stewardship. He was very proud of vastly expanding offshore drilling, even in the wake of the BP oil disaster, of promoting fracking here and through Secretary of State Hillary Clinton abroad, of making huge coal leases to the coal corporations, and more. And as a result of all of these things, we saw a skyrocketing of fossil fuels precisely when we needed to leave them in the ground. There was even a silencing of people on using the terms climate change, which I can tell you more about later if you want. Now, climate is not our only crisis, environmentally speaking. Not by any means. We have pollinators collapsing, which is really bad since we depend on pollination for a third of our food. We have fishery stocks crashing and many, many more things. We have the same dynamic on all of these. We're moving in the wrong direction under Democrats as well as Republicans. Now, why am I taking the time to tell you this, since I think a lot of you already understand this? I'm taking the time because I think one of the greatest barriers we have to moving forward is this myth that bit by bit, little victory by little victory, we are at least moving in the right direction. And the real problem is just Republicans keep obstructing things or they get in office. This is a powerful, powerful myth. And I think it's the greatest barrier to us doing what we need to do now to save ourselves. So I think we need to be talking about that and making that clear with the people we're talking to. That's one of the understandings that I came to grips with when I was forced to stop what I was doing, which was working for pay as an environmental activist, and look at what was going on, because I was realizing, I think maybe this isn't working. And I reached 4 other major understandings that I want to share with you today. And part of why I'm doing this is I think that this way of breaking things down, even if you're already there with me with these understandings, is perhaps helpful as we recruit other people to these sorts of understandings. So let's get on to the second one. The first is we're losing under Democrats as well as Republicans. And the second is that we're losing because you can't win under capitalism. You really just can't win. The system fuels environmental degradation, and it basically makes it impossible to put in place the solutions that we want. If you look at the basic structure of this economic system, here's what it looks like. You have the major industries owned by private entities and operated for private profit. So from the start, you have the major decisions of society being made by a few people, even though they're determining whether we're going to survive or not. They're holding the reins, they're making the big decisions. Then you have the mass of people being wage laborers, working for someone else, working for these very corporations, and needing to do whatever the corporations want to keep those jobs in the community, to keep those jobs in our households, because we need to keep putting food on the table. So we're extorted. And we don't have the money, the profit that's generated by our labor. That doesn't flow to public coffers, so we're always told it's an austerity time. We don't have the money for the solutions you want to put in place. And that big money does flow to the private owners at the top. It's supposed to. Capital is supposed to accumulate. This isn't accidental. This is like how the system works. So you have big money ending up in the hands of very few people, and they use it to distort absolutely everything. There's public relations campaigns and front groups spreading misinformation. The news media is owned. Science is infiltrated academia. They sue people who are making any traction. They sue governments that do anything good. Trade agreements are totally dominated by corporations. If we get something, it never gets implemented because they're out there preventing enforcement. And all of that is on top of what we always talk about, which is, isn't it terrible that corporations are controlling elections and flooding Congress with lobbyists? This is basically the opposite of democracy, just on its very nature, because you have a few people holding the reins and having the money, and most people having no money, feeling stressed, feeling extorted, and not holding the reins. That's the opposite of democracy. And in fact, researchers at Princeton and other places have documented what we all know. If you happen to be one of the people in that top crust of people, you can get your policies adopted. If you're in the great mass of people, they've shown with polls and other information that you have virtually no chance of getting the policies you want adopted because we don't have a democracy. Now, sometimes this disempowerment inherent in this system is really obvious. There's a really dramatic showdown between environmental activists and the big corporations, and we see what's happening and we see the disempowerment. But really, how this happens most of the times is much more subtle, because this corruption of democracy it's pervasive and insidious. And so people can't see it, because you're right in the middle of it and you can't see it. And that's why I'm talking with you about it at this level, because I think explaining it to people is part of how we're going to get people to join us in this movement. Really, most of the time, if you're an environmental activist, you're just struggling to even get your issue recognized as valid. You're just struggling to get the real solutions even mentioned on an agenda. You're even struggling to get to the table, because there's these tentacles of capitalism that are everywhere, and there's this crazy script that everybody's reading from that has nothing to do with what we need to be talking about, and we can't win under this system. We can't leave it in place. The people keep saying, well, can't we just regulate it or tweak it? It's inherently undemocratic. So what happens is we try to fight in this system is we have to funnel so many resources into one single campaign. So first thing we do is triage. We say, well, if we're going to win, we really got to focus on this one thing. And so we let all the other problems fester. And these are life and death problems we're jettisoning. And then we get some tiny win, and then they undo it by interrupting the implementation, getting it rescinded, or just replacing the one problem we solved with another. So, I personally have seen pesticides get banned, and they've already introduced the new really deadly pesticide to take its place. So you can't fix it, and there is an alternative. It's called socialism. It involves the public ownership of the major industries and a vibrant democratic structure from the grassroots up, from the workplaces and communities up. So we plan together for public good with these industries, and we have economic rights that are guaranteed. A job, a good paying job for everyone, good income when you're not working, free health care, free education, all those things. So that's what we need to be talking about. We can't get there in capitalism. We have to get beyond. The third understanding that I've reached, I think we all need to reach and share with people, is that unfortunately the environmental groups that we've been relying on, they're distorted by capitalism too, and they are not advancing the agendas and campaigns that we need, just not doing it. If you think about it, it's really a crazy, crazy setup. You've got big money, this capitalist system, creating these terrible do or die issues like global warming, and then you have the champions of the public, the nonprofit groups, or so we think, but they get most of their money from the rich people, from people who get to be philanthropists because they've done really well under capitalism. So the very first thing that is happening is that the people who are getting the big bucks, that are getting the microphones to get their messages amplified, are the people who are not going to rock the capitalist boat. The environmental justice groups, people of color, of low income, that bear the burden, the largest burden of environmental problems, those groups get less than 4% of Environmental Foundation funding. And the farm worker group that I worked with really struggled to get funding. And moderates are the ones that get funding. Studies show this, and we all know it. So from the get-go, you have this narrow range of people who are claiming the environmental mantle and aren't going to challenge the system. And by and large, unfortunately, environmental groups are part of the problem with their behaviors. The whole dynamic that I explained before of people thinking, oh, well, we're moving forward, we're making progress, that's perpetuated largely because environmental groups are telling everybody that, celebrating things, aiming low, compromising readily, having a big party, and it's very confusing. And they are part and parcel of misrepresenting the Democratic Party as our friends. There's endorsements going on, there's don't criticize the Democrats, and there's heavy-duty pressure on those of us who want to be honest about what the Democrats are doing. I personally was approached by people from an environmental organization that had more money and told we really needed to stop embarrassing the Democratic governor regarding her horrific actions on farm workers and pesticides because an election was coming up and we don't want her to look bad. And that stuff goes on all the time. So environmental groups are confusing things just when we need clarity. And since they're not identifying capitalism as something to get beyond, they're choosing campaigns and tactics not in the context of getting beyond capitalism. So people are engaging in ineffective strategies and being told, well, this is going to save us, call your congressperson, that's the way to save the world. And it's not true. We need to be honest about what's not effective. But worse, they're engaging in campaigns that I think reinforce capitalism. They're doing things like targeting a particular corporation, and we're all supposed to make them want to voluntarily do the right thing, which creates the impression that that's how it's supposed to work in democracy. We don't have power, they have power. If we really pressure them and be nice, and if we use our consumer power, then maybe we can get something to happen. And that's like not how democracy is supposed to work. So there's confusion being spread, and nonprofits are building their own organizations rather than a movement, competing with each other for members, and spreading widespread confusion. And we have to actually be aware of that and name it, because that's another big barrier that we're facing. The fourth general understanding that we need to share is that all the social justice issues are intertwined. It's so obvious if you spend 10 seconds seeing how they're connected. Military issues. Wars are the most destructive environmental thing possible. The military is responsible for vast numbers of Superfund and other toxic contamination sites. And we don't have any money for anything because all the money is going to war and the military. Poverty issues, totally connected. People have a harder time challenging the bosses if you're really poor. Environmental issues are hitting the poorest people the worst. The back and forth is obvious. But the bigger connection is that we are all facing the same barrier, which is capitalism. It's playing out in the same ways, with other groups having, scientific studies undercut them that are funded by corporations, and front groups undercutting them, all that kind of stuff. And the nonprofit movements in other social justice groups have also been made impotent. So on healthcare is just one example. 2009, Democratic control of the White House, 2 houses of Congress. Time for single payer, right? No, the Democrats came out and said, first thing we're making clear is single payer, Medicare for everybody is off the table. And so the less funded single payer groups stood up in Congress and objected and got arrested, and these well-funded healthcare groups all said, okay, that sounds good. And that led to what now masquerades as healthcare in this country, a Republican idea created by the Heritage Foundation. So all of the issues are connected, and we need to be joining together to build the mother of all movements to deal with our common enemy, capitalism. Which leads me to the fifth understanding that I think we need to have, which is we do, in fact, have power. So one of the big roles that the nonprofits are playing is they're spreading this mindset of no, we can't. They may say, we're all about yes, we can, but really they're about no, we can't. No, we can't do more than incremental change. Not possible. No, you can't vote for a candidate you agree with. You have to vote for the lesser evil. Or, no, you can't really get beyond capitalism. It's really too hard. All that no, we can't language, if we can see that for what it is and leave it behind, we'll recognize that we can, because we are indeed the 99%. And if we were to recognize our joint connections and power, we could strategize together and build campaigns that revolve around ultimately having strikes that build, that are supported by different layers of society, pouring into the street in a systematic way. There are things we can do once we recognize our power, and there are signs everywhere that the time is now. We have the phenomenon around Bernie Sanders, who called himself a socialist, and people didn't shy away from that. They flocked to that. We have polls showing that 70% of young people would vote socialist. We have, in the UK, the Labour Party's gaining ground rapidly, and they're calling for public ownership of the energy industry and other industries. 40-some% of people identify as independent, and it's only like 20-some% say they're Democrats now, and 20-some% say they're Republicans. Just multiple signs that it's a time for change. So those are kind of the understandings that I think we need to have and share with people, and maybe some of the language that I'm using would be helpful in the efforts you're making. We are losing, we're not actually moving forward, we are losing backwards under Democrats as well as Republicans. Can't win under capitalism. The nonprofits are not leading the way forward. We need to join with other social justice groups, and we actually do have power. So what does this all mean about what we need to do now at this point in human history that really is do or die? We need to each be courageously telling the truth about all this stuff, pointing out that we're losing. There's an alternative. It's called socialism. We have power. Now, we can be careful about how we do this. We don't have to open our discussions with people with the S word, socialism. I'm talking with people all the time about, boy, isn't this crazy that these few chemical corporations, and by the way, 85-some% of people for decades in the US have felt corporations have too much power. So I go with that. I say these corporations are like calling the shots. And then I point out, a bunch of them aren't even US corporations. They're like owned by Saudi Arabia and other countries. Wouldn't it be better if we owned these industries and made these decisions? And people respond to that, and I haven't used the S word even though I'm talking about socialism, and I will get there with people. We need to stop supporting the language of abdication, which is all around us. For example, people are always talking about, let's hold corporations accountable. No. We want to be in the driver's seat. We don't want to be begging somebody to do something. We want to own those major corporations. Or people are talking about, let's rebuild the middle class. Well, middle means there's upper that's hoarding the wealth, and there's lower that's getting dumped on. We don't want that either. We don't want classes. We want equity. Or people saying, our goal is to lower the price of solar cells. That's a big one. That's our goal. No. Our goal is to deploy the solar cells. That's what we need to do. We need to leave the Democrats behind. It's an abusive relationship. We need to get out of that. And we need to be joining with other socialists. The discussion that will happen at the end of this university will be a key one. Join with others to talk about how do we move forward? What is the vision? Now, does all this mean that we can't be involved in incremental reforms anymore? No, it doesn't mean that. We have to be engaged in the struggles around us. But the key thing has to be, we have to be demanding that they're building the way to socialism. They're not reinforcing capitalism. That's the crucial thing. We need to be involved so we can find each other and illuminate the way forward. So I'm going to wrap up shortly, but I want to talk specifically about climate change and a couple things that I think we need to be doing and be aware of. One is, for anybody who's involved in a climate issue organization, I think we should be out there proactively trying to get the organization to come out and demand public ownership of the energy industry with democratic management and economic rights. Let's just push that envelope and start getting the conversation going that way. The other, much bigger thing that we need to be doing, and I realize this is gigantic, but this is in fact what we have to do, is we need to be finding a way to talk with other social justice activists to flesh out in detail what this world beyond capitalism is going to look like. We need to be developing this detailed blueprint that is a social justice action plan that encompasses climate action. And as we do it, we need to assume there's public ownership of the major industries as part of this, and we have the resources to work with. So we have to pretend we have a democratic society and not just talk about incentives and tax credits and that stuff. Instead, we should, in this plan, lay out specifically, okay, where are we going to deploy which renewable energy source? There's more than enough to move us beyond nuclear and fossil fuels. Reaching our mix by discussing with indigenous people, low-income people who have been dumped on by climate change, so we make sure the solutions also don't dump on people. So we identify the best mix, and we talk about when and where we're deploying it. And then on the fossil fuel side of things, we identify the specific fossil fuel mining and refining infrastructure, and we talk about when we're going to close it down, what the jobs are going to be, how we're going to have jobs for everybody. And when I talk about planning for jobs, I'm not talking about setting up some bureaucracy, like a just transition bureaucracy, and then people have to go through that whole nightmare of applying for aid, and then we hope we get the people covered who need to be covered. We actually need to identify who's going to be affected and identify where we need the jobs for the things we need for society and how we're going to make that happen. In this plan, we need to be thinking really big and do things like say, you know, productivity, labor productivity has increased over the decades. We should be working fewer hours. Why don't we have as part of our plan a 25-hour work week? Would that be good? And, you know, people will have time for self-governance. People will feel secure because they have good paying jobs and guaranteed income when they're not working. And I think when we develop this detailed plan and we show people that the resource exists, the solutions exist, there's a way to do this, and our lives can be so much better, that's when we're going to make the quantum leap forward. I think people are waiting for that. Now, as we do this, we have to be aware that the same dynamic that I was talking about before is still in play. So, there are a bunch of people out there, nonprofit voices, Democratic Party voices, that are now saying, we're already doing that. We're already developing the bold new plan forward, and we have to be tracking that and be aware that so far that stuff isn't real. We need to be moving forward with the real stuff. So let me explain. There's a variety of cities and states that have said we're going to do a bold climate action plan. There are a couple big bills in Congress that purport to do that, and they sound really great at the news conference. They say, you know, we're going to have 100% renewable energy by such and such a year. But when you look at them, they're not that great. The 100% energy goal is only for a spectrum, part of the spectrum of the greenhouse gas sources that we have. And even though they have some mandatory language, it's really vague. They don't spell out what we're actually doing, and they talk about incentives and tax credits and that kind of stuff. There's no consequences if you don't reach the goals. And we've already been setting goals for decades and we keep missing them. So even though it feels mandatory, it feels, even though it's supposedly mandatory, it feels aspirational to me. But the bigger problem is that they're not taking on the fossil fuel industry. They're just not doing it. So you have the cities and states that are developing these plans just kind of ignoring the fact that there's like fossil fuels being pulled out of the ground and refined in the state. Just kind of not mentioning that. We'll just talk about encouraging public transit and renewables, and that's deadly. And then in the bills in Congress, they're talking about fossil fuel moratoriums, which sounds really great until you look at it. And what they're talking about is moratoriums on federal permits. They don't even deal with all the state permitting going on, but on federal permits for new infrastructure for fossil fuels. So the key to this is that because of Barack Obama's policies and Donald Trump's and George Bush's policies, we have absolutely gigantic infrastructure. And we have fossil fuel corporations sitting on huge troves of oil and gas, and they want to take it out of the ground. And it's going to be game over if they do that. So you can't just ignore that. Because guess what? You can increase your renewables. You can do it. And you can say, "Ooh, look at us. We really increased them." But if you don't stop the fossil fuels being taken out of the ground and burned, we are doomed. We are doomed. So we have to be aware of what's going on with that dynamic, because this is the decision point right now. Are we going to keep nipping around the edges? Are we going to keep accepting what basically is a strategy of let's not, but say we did? That's what's been happening, and we've been accepting that. Are we going to keep accepting that, going in the wrong direction instead of the right direction and pretending we're going the right way? Or are we going to organize to take control of our future so that we can deploy the solutions, so that we can stop the deadly actions that are going on? For decades, we've been fighting within capitalism and without a larger plan and demands, without a larger social justice movement. I was told 20 years ago solar panels are about to take over because their price is going down, and now we're at less than 1% of solar energy in the US. And I was told, 5, 10 years ago, oh, we're getting greenhouse gases down. Well, there's been slight dips in the US greenhouse gas emissions in recent years, but it's not anywhere near what we need. And most people agree it's just because we had an economic downturn. And what's more, if you look at the actual footprint of the US, we are exporting coal, we're exporting oil and gas more and more and more, and we are importing more and more products from countries. So those greenhouse gases are our greenhouse gases, but we're not counting them. And if you look at the planet, greenhouse gases up, 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 steady as can be, up, up, up. Temperatures up, up, up. And we can't just ignore that that's happening. So it's time to articulate a new vision of democracy and fight for it. It is pretty much the only way to save ourselves on the environment. And what's more, in the absence of us laying out a vision that really makes a difference in people's lives and really shows the way forward, this vacuum is going to continue. You're going to have Democrats saying, your lives are better, and people know they're not better, and environmental groups and Democrats saying we're moving forward, and people know it's a lie, people really do. And people are sick of politicians and nonprofits lying, and people are struggling, and that vacuum is where people who foment racism and bigotry can really thrive. It's where people like Donald Trump arise from. So we have to be aware of that. Basically, there really are no two ways about it. We are in a really do or die crisis on environmental and other issues, and there's no two. The only way to deal with this problem is to get beyond capitalism. That's what we need to organize for. So thank you. I hope these thoughts are, and the way I frame it as somebody who started out as an environmentalist and became a socialist, could be helpful for all of you as you work with people and we organize together on this issue.